we'll start with Judy Chamberlin, whom all of us know by name from her publications. First and foremost, her famous book On Our Own, first published in 1977 already, about the perspective of people who have or are using mental health systems and who want and have ideas and concepts about alternatives to the system. This book has been translated into many languages and has been republished. Recently, Judy Chamberlin is associated with Boston University. She's the co-founder of the National Empowerment Center in Washington. She's on the board of many important and influential organizations like NAPA, MDRI, the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. She served on many influential commissions in the policy making and political sphere, and I look very much forward to listening to her on her topic of whose voice, whose choice, and especially whose power. Thank you very much, Judy.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to try to keep the presentation short because I hope that we will have time for questions and discussion. Whose voice, whose choice, whose power? I'm going to start by reading you a quotation, which the relevance of which may not seem clear at the beginning, but I hope will become clear as we go on. Slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible in both Testaments, from Genesis to Revelation. It has existed in all ages, has been found among the people of the highest civilization, and in nations of the highest proficiency in the arts. That's from Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America, the South in the United States, the losing side in our Civil War in the 1860s. Since he wrote those words, the historical context has shifted. So we no longer see slavery as natural and inevitable. And to the 21st century mind, this quote appears strange, quaint, antiquated, morally obtuse. Today, many people around the world think of coercive psychiatry as natural and inevitable. And it is my contention that history is continuing to shift, and that to the 22nd century mind, coercive psychiatry may equally appear as a vestige of the past. I'd like to read you another quote. It's one of my favorites, from C.S. Lewis. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And that's the rationale for coercive psychiatry, that it's done for the good of people diagnosed as mentally ill. The belief is that some people need to be protected from themselves, from their own impulses, that their impulses come not from free will but from mental illness, and that psychiatrists, because of their training, are in a position to decide when some behavior is a manifestation of mental illness, and that they're in a position to decide what's right for those people. It raises questions of social organization. Who decides? Who puts some some groups in power over other groups. Who makes those decisions? How is society organized so that some groups have power and other groups don't? And these are questions of social organization. And what they ultimately come down to is a question of power. Power is a word that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. A lot of people don't like to talk about power, think about it. When we discuss difficult subjects, I often like to start by going to the dictionary, looking at how the dictionary defines power. And of course, there are a number of definitions for this word. The one that seemed most relevant to our discussion today was power is a right or authority given or delegated to a person or body. And historically, psychiatrists have been in this position over people designated as mentally ill. They have had the power to decide what we need and when we need it. And we are now living in a time of a historical shift where people with mental illness, like other groups that have historically been without power, are in the process of claiming our right to self-determination. And I say our right to self-determination because I am a person who was diagnosed with a mental illness. At the age of 21, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I was put into a mental hospital against my will. I was involuntarily treated with drugs. I found the whole experience to be devastating, to be an assault on my personhood, and I was able, within a relatively short time, to leave the psychiatric system and to regain power and control over my own life, and have been part of the psychiatric survivor movement for many, many years. So that's the perspective that I'm speaking of. The question really is, who speaks for the person who's diagnosed? Who speaks for the person who's called a patient? And again, when we take the historical view, people with a mental illness diagnosis were seen as incapable of articulating what their own best interest was. Their stated preferences were seen as unimportant or irrelevant or getting in the way of what psychiatry thought were their best interests. The power of psychiatry in law derives from two legal principles. One is called the parens patriae principle, and that means the state acting in the role of parent. As parents of small children have the right to speak for them and to make decisions for them, because as children they lack the ability to make decisions for themselves. Adults with mental illness were seen as being like children, and the state and its designated agent, psychiatry, had the power of parents over people, even though they were adults. So that power of psychiatry is practiced allegedly for the good of the person. There's also a power of psychiatry that's practiced for the good of the general public, and that's what's called the police power, the power to protect society from people who are deemed to be dangerous because of their diagnosis of mental illness. So these are the two legal bases on which psychiatrists have power over people diagnosed as mentally ill. Instead, we in the psychiatric survivor movement say, no one can speak for us. We speak for ourselves. We have the right to speak for ourselves. And since the 1970s, people who've been diagnosed and labeled as mentally ill have been forming our own organizations all over the world. Historically, these efforts actually go back several centuries. We can look back and find efforts to organize groups of patients going back excuse me, several hundred years. But those efforts until the 1970s didn't continue. But now, since the 1970s, our movement is growing worldwide, and our organizations have two major focuses. One is advocacy, working to achieve legal rights, working to achieve self-determination, and the other is the development of self-help alternatives. And these are both psychiatric survivor or user movement. Psychiatric survivor or user movement. I think it's important to talk about terminology, what we are called, who names us, and we're commonly called patients, and I think we'll hear that term used a lot here at this conference. Most of us don't like this term because it puts us firmly in a medical model context, which we reject. And so we use other terms, and some of these terms I think make some people uncomfortable, including users, people who use or have used psychiatric services, survivors, people who see ourselves as having survived the psychiatric system or having survived this phenomenon called mental illness, consumers, which is a word used mostly in the United States, like users, people who use or consume psychiatric services. And the question really is, whose terminology is the one that controls, who again has the power to name. And the power to name is very important. It's not just a matter of semantics. The power to name is an important power. Words do have power. Words carry all kinds of additional meanings. When we accept the label of patients, it implies an acceptance of the medical model, of the right of psychiatrists to make decisions for us. Thank you. The word patient carries with it certain assumptions, that we have an illness, that we are under medical care, that we need to be taken care of. And when we name ourselves, we take back the power. Like other movements, where the naming process has gone on. Black people, women, indigenous people, and gays all have engaged in this process of renaming and saying we reject what other people call us. We must call ourselves and be called by the names that we ourselves choose. It's a very important power, and we can't just say, oh, that's just semantics, it's not important what you're called. It is very important what people choose to call themselves. The user-survivor movement has certain basic principles, and these are overarching. They vary from organization to organization around the world, but they basically fall into certain major categories. And the main one is that we speak for ourselves, that other people may claim to speak for us, but no one can speak in our voice. Our own voice is our own authentic voice, the voice of people who themselves have been labeled. That freedom and self-determination are basic human rights that must not be eroded or ended because of a medical diagnosis. That if we want some kind of help in our lives, many of us do, but we have to determine what form that help takes, where we get it, who we get it from. It can't just be something that other people decide, this is the kind of help you get, this is where you must go to get that help. And much of the help that we find most helpful are in self-help programs, mutual support programs, programs that are themselves operated and controlled by people who have experienced psychiatry, and these programs are voluntary and run by users. Our movement exists around the world with national organizations of users and survivors in more than 50 countries, all over the world, North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. We have at least 2 international organizations, both of which are represented here at this conference, the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, and Mind Freedom International. When I say more than 50 countries, at the last World Congress of the World Network, there were 50 countries represented, 10 of them in Africa alone. At our previous conference, let's see, the last conference was 2004 in Denmark. In 2001 in Vancouver, Canada, we had 15 countries, so from 15 to 50 in just 3 years. And at that conference, 15 countries, none of them in Africa. In 2004, 10 countries in Africa alone. We now understand there are at least 15 national organizations in Africa, and our next World Congress is being planned for 2008 in Uganda. So this is a growing movement, and it's growing all over the world, not just in the industrialized parts of the world. The main question that we're here to address at this Congress is the question of coercion. When is it appropriate to use coercion? And in our movement, we recognize a clear distinction between what we think is a legitimate right of the state to take a person's liberty. And that's when people have broken the law. Laws are written, codified, you know what the law is, you know that it's not legal to murder people, to rob, to assault. But when you're accused of breaking the law, you have legal safeguards, you're entitled to a trial, you have a legal defense, you have the right of appeal, and only after the state has proven that you have committed a crime do you lose your liberty. And the situation is very, very different in the case of people with the label of mental illness, because we lose our liberty even when we haven't broken the law. The standard varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but generally it's around being unable to care for oneself because of mental illness, or being dangerous to oneself or others because of mental illness. And this is a very elastic standard. And also that there's not a trial, that psychiatrists are the ones who decide that we're mentally ill, and they're the ones who decide whether we lose our liberty or not. The psychiatrists in that case act as judge and jury. And psychiatrists often claim that there's a clear difference because criminals get put in prison for punishment, whereas we get put in a hospital for treatment. But to those of us who have experienced being put in a hospital involuntarily, it certainly feels like a prison to us. So some may ask coercion when. We say coercion never. That coercion is never appropriate in the case of people who haven't broken the law. That as human beings, we have a basic right to self-determination. And we see that the practice of medicine should not be one of power and control, but instead should be a cooperative effort, where a person is in some sort of distress. They seek out a doctor because they believe that the doctor can help them with that distress. And that's the paradigm, that's the model for other branches of medicine. And we believe that that should be the model for psychiatry as well. Of course, there's what's called the emergency exception, because not all medical patients are capable of giving consent. And the example that's usually used is there's an auto accident, a person's hit by a car, they're lying in the street, they're unconscious, they're bleeding. They can't give consent, but we say that this is an emergency. There's a societal consensus that this is an emergency. Consent is not necessary. The ambulance comes, they take them to the hospital, they institute whatever treatment is necessary, because the person is not capable in that situation of giving consent. But once the person regains consciousness, once the person regains the ability to make decisions, a person can wake up, look around, say, this is a hospital, I'm a Christian Scientist, I don't believe in hospitals, I don't believe in medicine, I believe in prayer. They regain the power. So the emergency is only in a tightly defined and tightly time-limited situation. And what psychiatrists claim is that for many people who are diagnosed as mentally ill, there's an analogous situation, because the emergency is that the person's delusional, they're not aware of their need for treatment, they're not aware of their own best interests, and this is seen as directly comparable to the unconscious person who's bleeding and needs immediate medical attention. And we in the psychiatric survivor movement claim that this is a flawed analogy. Because these phenomena, delusions, being unaware of your need for treatment, being unaware of your own best interests, are are phenomena that can be defined by different people in different ways. And the person who's defining that you're delusional or unaware of your own best interest is the same person who's taking away your liberty. We believe that people have the right to be different. People have the right to non-conventional behavior, to non-conventional beliefs, to go against the consensus of society, as long as their behavior remains within the confines of the law. People have what we call the right to be wrong. And again, this comes down to a question of power. Who gets to decide when a person's behavior is so out of the norm that it constitutes a psychiatric emergency that gives the psychiatric system the right to assume control over a person's life? We are now in a time of evolving international human rights law. One of the things that came out of the devastation of World War II was the concept of international human rights and the development of the United Nations. And in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognized the basic human rights of all people, that these were fundamental rights that everyone had by virtue of being human. Since 1948, the United Nations has recognized various subgroups of people who have the same rights as defined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But because of special vulnerabilities or a lack of standing in society, need special protections. And so we've seen a series of other UN conventions, the rights of women, the rights of the child, the rights of indigenous people. Not saying that these groups had special rights, not at all, that they have the same rights as everyone else, but they need special protection because of their special vulnerabilities, because of their position in society. And this human rights law is now evolving to recognize that people with disabilities are also among a group that needs special protections to make sure that their rights are protected. And so we have in just last year, 2006, the adoption by the United Nations of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. This convention was drafted over a period of several years with major participation by disabled people's organizations. That is, organizations of people run and controlled by people with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities, blind people, deaf people, people with mobility impairments, people with intellectual disabilities, and also people with psychiatric disabilities, including both of the international organizations that I mentioned earlier, the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, and the Mind Freedom International, sorry. And both of these organizations were very involved in drafting the convention. Among many protections that the convention offers, the ones I'm going to focus on because they're relevant to our discussion today, is the right of people with disabilities to legal capacity to make decisions about their own lives, and that legal capacity rests with the person, because historically people with disabilities have been denied that right, and that some people, because of the nature of their disability, may need support in decision making, but that support has to be offered to the person, and it has to be offered in ways that are acceptable to the person, and it's up to the person whether or not to accept support in decision making. What we want is the dignity of risk. Historically, people with disabilities have been seen as, because of their disability, as childlike, as unable to make decisions, as needing other people to protect them, and that protection very often has been exercised in ways that the people with disabilities themselves find as oppressive and unhelpful and hampering their ability to become independent adults. When you protect people from the consequences of their own decision-making, they are kept in a role of permanent childlike status. And like other people, people with disabilities need the opportunity to exercise their decision-making power, possibly to make mistakes, to fail, to learn from those mistakes and to move on. And that's how people change and grow. So we come back to where we started, this question of slavery. At one time, and in some parts of the world still today, it's viewed as a natural condition for some people. Slave masters saw their slaves, they saw themselves in a paternalistic role. The slave was inferior because of race or ethnic group or some other status. They're childlike, they need to be protected. The slave master was benevolent. The slave master saw slavery as a benign institution. And that's how slave masters viewed slavery, but it raises the question, how did slaves view slavery? And of course, they viewed it very differently. So slaves were viewed as childlike and needing protection. Now we see that people called mental patients are viewed as ill and needing protection. Slave masters saw slavery as a benign institution. Psychiatric coercion is seen as a benign exercise of people practicing for, doing that for the best interest of the person. Slaves were not heard from, their voices were silenced, and similarly our voices as patients, as people labeled with mental illness, have been silenced. But slaves and patients, we have spoken. And there are documents from history that we can find in which people who were held in slavery did speak, did write, and were heard. And some of the famous names from the American South were Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. But there were many, many others that were less well known, and slave narratives continue to be discovered, even into the present day. And of course, from many other parts of the world, we have these narratives as well. Similarly, there are narratives written by patients. Many of the names of people who've written are not well known, but one document that I found in my research lists hundreds of narratives from A to Z, from anonymous to Zwerin. Gail Hornstein, who's a professor at Mount Holyoke College in the United States, has a bibliography published most recently revised in 2005, which has over 900 published personal testimonies. The earliest one published in 1436 by people who were deemed mentally ill, or in those days they didn't use the term mentally ill, crazy, possessed by devils, whatever. And she also lists nearly 30 websites that compile personal testimony. So although our voices are seldom heard, we're certainly not silent, and we speak up, and we continue to speak up. And when you look at the narratives, one theme that runs through them is that most people who've been subjected to psychiatric coercion view it as not at all a benign experience, but instead an experience of injustice, an experience of loss of personhood, loss of rights, ultimately harmful to the person. And one emotion that runs through most of these narratives is a burning anger and a burning desire for change and to achieve rights and to achieve justice. So our voices may not be heard, but they're far from silent. Which brings us to this final question that we're here to spend 3 days discussing. Who decides when coercion is justified? This is an important question of public policy. It's not just a question within psychiatry, it's a question for all of society to look at and to grapple with. Because we're the ones who are subjected to it, because we're the ones whose liberty is being taken away, there must be a major role for users and survivors in this debate. We also need to hear from legislators, we need to hear from jurists, we need to hear from ethicists, we need to hear from the general public, we need to hear from everyone. It's too important a question to be decided just within psychiatry. And we always need to put this discussion within the historical framework And we also need to put this discussion within the framework of human rights law as it is evolving and continues to evolve. I believe it's ultimately a moral question, that we have a moral imperative to look at this question in broad historical terms, that we must look at the historical shift from paternalism to self-determination, as it has affected many groups within society, as it is now affecting people with disabilities, particularly people with psychiatric disabilities, that these are ultimately questions of human dignity and human rights. And the slogan of the disability movement worldwide, I think, best sums up what it is that we want, what it is that we believe is just, and what we believe that will ultimately prevail, which is nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. Certainly we will not have the quantity of discussion that you want, but I think you've given a chance to stick to a certain quality of discussion from there on, and we have only a few minutes now for audience to react with questions or comments.
Arnold Fraunfeld from Switzerland. How do you deal with severely suicidal people?
Okay, good question, because I'm a person who periodically goes through periods of suicidal depression. We deal with people with suicidal depression the way we deal with people with any emotional crisis. We offer help, we offer support, we offer refuge. Notice that I say offer. We make these things available, we make known to the person that these things exist. When people have opportunities to seek out places that are voluntary, where they're not compelled to be, many people do take up these offers. Some people don't. Ultimately, it's a personal choice. What we do know is that involuntary commitment does not save lives. There's statistical evidence that shows, for example, that the suicide rate does not differ from state to state in the United States, no matter how strict the commitment laws are. That commitment laws that make it easier to commit or harder to commit do not affect the suicide rate. That in fact some people commit suicide because of the experience of being involuntarily treated. The most famous example being Ernest Hemingway, who was involuntarily committed because of suicidal thoughts, was given electric shock treatment, which affected his memory, and told a close friend shortly before he killed himself that the shock treatments had erased his memory, that his memory was, as he put it, his capital as a writer. The thing he needed in order to practice his profession was his memory. His memory was now gone. He said without his memory he was nothing. He went out and shot himself. Involuntary commitment is believed to save lives. It does not save lives. When we offer people loving, caring, voluntary refuge, many of them will take that opportunity.
Thank you very much, both of you, and let us take this as an example of how many questions can be asked, can be discussed, can be agreed, disagreed, and be controversially discussed. There is a culture of discussion that could enrich the field in an amazing way, and this is one of the core questions that many people in the audience, and thank you for asking it and thank you for answering it.